Thanks very much, Nigel. And I think we're just going to take a minute to thank the Civo Navigate team. We're getting towards the end of a really great couple of days of conference, and they've done fantastic work to put this on and bring everyone together. So as Nigel said, I'm the CEO of an organization called Open UK, which is quite a different organization, partly because it focuses on open technology as opposed to purely on open source software, which covers a multitude of sins, including things like open innovation, which recently allowed us to support the Llama 2 release from Meta. We focus on people, and we focus on people rather than companies, because we believe that bringing the people together creates a cohesive voice, and that the companies follow behind the people. And that's particularly important in the UK, because so many of our great people work for international companies, and we wouldn't want to not have them be part of the work we do. So I think when you leave this panel, the one thing you will all be saying is that that was too short. Now, I think that because we're basically going to have a discussion this afternoon with 3 friends of mine. And it's the kind of discussion that I would have. Generally, I won't have all 3 of these people together, but one-on-one or even with a couple of them about open source. And we have this conversation on a very, very regular basis. And we have it on an increasingly regular basis as we see open source come under threat, come under challenge. And this morning in Kelsey's keynote, any of you who were there couldn't have escaped the fact that he was pretty down on it in many ways, pretty down on it as a maintainer, pretty down on it in the HashiCorp conversation. And that's the kind of stuff we're going to touch on in the next 45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So we rearranged the furnishing. I hope you like our arrangement this afternoon. We felt it was a bit more comfortable. I also am going to very quickly introduce you to these people as I know them. So I view Liz Rice, who is an Open UK board member, as the queen of cloud native. I've been around KubeCon with her, and I have just seen people fall at her feet. She is one of the best known engineers, I think, anywhere in open source and anywhere on the planet. We then have Matt Barker, who I've known since, I think, his first or second job after university. I've known him a very long time, who is Open UK's entrepreneur in residence and has really shown tremendous forfeiture, and the work he's done as a founder within the UK at JetStack is quite incredible. And he's stuck very true to his open source principles as he's worked through that. Peter Zaitsev. Peter is not based in the UK, but he is part of the Open UK team in as much as he's on our advisory board for State of OpenCon. And I got to know Peter about 18 months ago speaking at Percona Live in the US, and would never have imagined that we would have become such good friends. So I want you to sort of imagine this scenario as being my living room as opposed to a stage in the middle of central London and a Saturday night conversation. I'm afraid the glasses have water in them, and they probably wouldn't have water in them if you were all at my house. And I'm going to ask a very quick question, and the answer is yes or no before we start the questions that we talked about in prepping for the panel. Liz, do you believe in open source? Yes or no answer?
Yes.
Matt, do you believe in open source?
Yes.
Peter, do you believe in open source?
Of course.
Right. Amanda Brock, do you believe in open source? Yes, of course. So we start on the premise that we all believe in open source, but I suspect that you're going to be a little bit surprised with where some of this conversation goes. So we're going to start by asking what is open source. And as a lawyer, I'm very quickly going to say, I no longer am a lawyer, but 25 years of doing it is kind of hard to shake off. Open source, of course, is a licensing category. We have proprietary software and we have open source software. Those are the only 2 established categories of software. And to be open source, something ought to be on an OSI-approved license, which means that the OSI has approved it as complying with the definition, the open source definition. The definition has a couple of key clauses, or key requirements, 5 and 6, which effectively mean that anybody can use open source software for any purpose. Now, although my background's legal, and that's pretty much a legal definition, I think open source is so much more than just that. And it's about community, it's about collaboration, and it's about contribution. But Liz, what do you think open source is?
So I'm not a lawyer, and I've never been a lawyer. And so I don't really care very much about the license. I'm much more interested in the ability to run a project that is open, that's visible, that people can, as an engineer, get to grips with, experiment with. People can collaborate on it. You can have communities that cross those kind of company boundaries. And I think I was pretty late into open source in my career. I spent the first several years in proprietary software. And then I think seeing how much you can innovate and how incredibly successful some of these open source projects are, that's why I said yes to do I believe in open source. I think it's a fantastic way of innovating and through collaboration, through the best minds in the planet. That, to me, is much more important than the licensing.
Peter, thoughts on that?
Okay, well, and thank you, God, I'm not a lawyer, too. Yeah, so, for me, I think when I speak about a license for open source, that is necessary, but not sufficient. I think if you think about like a practical use of open source, there are a couple of other things which I think are important. One is their intent, right? And I think that intent of creating a public good, which is very important, right? I think if you look at recent Red Hat actions, for example, there is discussions wherever that was, in line with open source and kind of GPL restrictions or not. But you know what? For me, it does not matter. That was not in the spirit of open source, right? Then instead of saying, well, we are in about, hey, shared innovation, right, and empowering the ecosystem about, making sure we are the only company which, can grab as much value as possible, that is not in the spirit of open source,
so
right?
So this spirit that you keep talking about, it's not in the glasses on the table. What is this spirit of open source that you're talking about?
Well, what a spirit of open source, right? I believe the spirit of open source is about giving, not about taking, right? I sometimes like comparing the open source, to fundamental science, right? Think about when Isaac Newton discovered gravity, right? It's not about, well, I only want to keep that to myself, right? And I only want to benefit from that. Hey, let's share that. Let that be known. Let other people to build on my discoveries, right? And I think that is what that original spirit of open source is, right? And I think that is not surprise because open source really came about from a scientific community in its early days, right? I also like to compare the spirit of open source to artists, right? When you are saying, hey, I want to create something because that's who I am, right? It's not about how much I can make from it, but I cannot, draw or write, right, or something else because, well, I cannot not to do it. That is what true open source is about.
So one of the things that I think comes out of what you're saying there, Peter, is the fact, and I know we've discussed this so many times, there's lots of different things you can say that open source is or isn't, but what you definitely cannot say it is a business model. And actually, I would argue that proprietary software also isn't a business model. It's the kind of license that the software has got as a legal category, and then you'll have royalties or support or whatever that's your business model. Matt, what's open source for you?
I think the meaning of open source to me has definitely changed quite significantly over the time that I've actually been in the open source community. In some ways, it's been my life because I've spent almost all my career doing it, which is almost 20 years. And for me, what open source meant when I first engaged in it was all about passion, community, scientific breakthroughs, innovation, fundamentally a way to build better code with other people. And people weren't doing it thinking about the commercial impact of why they were doing it. So it was interesting when Kelsey was speaking today, he was saying, well, I created this open source project and I don't want to be giving this update to someone who might be able to use it to make money from it. Well, no one that I knew in those early days really cared about that. All they cared about was just doing it for the pure love and joy of making better software and doing something that could give back to other people that they could use and then benefit from. The time that changed for me was about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years into my journey in open source, and I spoke to one very, very successful billionaire open source founder, and I asked him what open source meant in a bar in London in about 2012, 2013, and he said, well, it's just a great distribution model. And I could not believe that that was the answer. And for me, that's when things started to change. And since then, I think we've been on a little bit of a slippery slope where the distribution model that open source enables gives commercial interests a much greater way of being able to leverage that and make more money than if they almost start as a proprietary company. And I think since then, that slippery slope has meant that I think we've got to a point where open source is actually in a bit of an identity crisis. Because what I knew open source as is somewhat changed. And I think we're going to have to maybe, at this point, rethink what open source means to us. Because if I was to start a company tomorrow, I'm not sure I would just go straight ahead and create an open source project under an Apache 2.0 license. I'd have to really think about whether I was going to do that or not. And I think that's where I'm at right now. I'm a little bit concerned because that band that you used to go and see for free in your local pub is now ultra successful and leading to some of the world's biggest commercial entities. And now you have to go and pay 150, 200 pounds to go and see them at a stadium. And I think that's where we're at with open source. It's almost become the de facto standard. But the original meaning of what open source is, to me, is almost being lost.
It's a very interesting way of looking at it. And I assume that billionaire you were talking to in a bar in London isn't the one that we worked for together at Canonical.
No.
But he has some quite interesting input on what open source is. And in his Open Source Underdogs podcast, I just love these podcasts. And I know Peter's got one, and Liz, you've got one now too, haven't you? With the guys at Glue. The thing that Mark Shuttleworth says about open source is it depends on how you found it, what you'll view it as being. And if you've come to it as a community contributor, as many of the early people did, you'll view it as a community collaborative thing. And if you've come to it through enterprise usage or you've come to it through collaboration around companies, you'll probably view it in that way. And I actually think he's often right, annoyingly, but I think he was probably right about how people view it and why we all view it in so many different ways. But what I think we would all agree on is that we've seen open source come under attack in the last few years, and sort of working out why that is, I think, is the next step. So what open source is for us is different things. Why is it now coming under such attack? Liz?
So I don't even agree that it's under attack. I think businesses, unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society, and we need to get paychecks, and that's just the way it is. It's we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but that's the reality we live in. Businesses have to make money. We have to turn our talents into paychecks somehow. And this is where sometimes, when we think about things like the spirit of open source and the sort of, this very altruistic idea of giving stuff away, there is an element of, I relate to that sort of artistry idea and the idea of getting my stuff out there. But fundamentally, if I'm going to put work in, day out, I want to get paid for it. And I think what I think you're describing as open source being under attack relates to companies exploring different options to figure out how to have a business model that is, open source is not a business model, but finding ways to generate value around open source, because you need something that you can sell, you need something that people will pay for. There's got to be some value, and the code you're giving away is not that value. It's got to be something else alongside it. I think maybe some of these different licenses are looking at ways to say, how can I prevent other people from making more money than me on my software?
I think you're exactly right. And for me, people often assume that because I'm very definite about what the definition of open source is, that I don't think there are other ways of distributing software that are appropriate. And it's all fine. like you, I came to open source quite late in my career, and I worked on proprietary deals for a long time before I got to open source. But when I got to open source, when I joined Canonical, I felt like I'd come home. I suddenly met people with my value set, the sort of open source values that Peter's talking about. And for me, that was the right place for me to fit in, and those match my values. But I then went on to a law firm, and in the law firm, I used to advise people, and they would come to me because I was one of the most prominent lawyers in Europe at the time, because there weren't many, doing open source, right? And
There still aren't many now.
there still aren't many, no, I know. But the question I would say to them is, what if, right? You want to open source this. What if someone else uses it? And mostly they would get that that was okay, because that's the nature of open source. And then I say, what if someone else makes money? And you could see them start to flinch in many cases. They just hadn't got their heads round that there was no non-commercial carve-out in open source. And then the third thing, and remember, Matt and I were in Canonical. We'd just been through being the first company that really had our code used at scale by the cloud providers, 13, 14 years ago, around 2010? Canonical was definitely the first there. And my third question is, what if someone else takes your code and makes a lot of money and you don't? And you have to have the stomach for that if you're going to open source it. Otherwise, you just shouldn't. Matt?
Yeah, I think you do have to accept that. I think it all depends on what you want and what your outcome is. To Liz's point about making money and creating a commercial model around it, that's absolutely fine. No problem in that whatsoever. I think even joining the open source community, I guess, as long ago as I did, it was pretty clear to me, I think even Richard Stallman made it clear that there's absolutely no problem with making money out of open source. That's absolutely fine. You know, anyone can do that. I think the problem that I've got with it is like, how much money? And it feels to me like what we're trying to do is just maximize the amount of our stock options are worth. And we're doing that by being a little bit skeptical about what open source is. So you'll see people creating an open source project. Oh, come by, oh, we're part of this open source movement. You know, come and use our software, it's going to be great. And then all of a sudden, you know, you have a sales target to hit. So you might be a little bit less focused on the meetups and the communities. So you start to focus more on putting salespeople in to try and optimize the sale around the service. Then all of a sudden they realize that's quite difficult to monetize open source software. And so at that point then you get maybe to get some investment, and an investor says you're not hitting your numbers, and then all of a sudden you have to think about license changes, and before you know it you go for IPO, and all of that, it just feels like a skeptical, well, it's almost like a slow but steady slide into, I want my options to be worth the most, I want to be able to make the most money from this IPO, so therefore I'm going to start messing with what the actual foundation of fundamentals of open source is. I knew lots of people 10, 15 years ago that were running very pure open source companies and doing very well for themselves with a nice, what you might call a lifestyle business, but they weren't looking to try and make hundreds of £1,000s for themselves. They were looking for a nice lifestyle where they could give back to the community and sell services through support and however else they wanted to do it. So I think it depends on what you want to do. I think what I really have the problem with is this sort of idea of like using open source goodwill, as it were, to create a user base of which then you can abuse by changing the license or messing with it in some ways. I think that's what I really worry about.
And I think you and Peter have got very particular stories because you've both run pure open source businesses, and maybe I'm just going to poke each of you a little bit on that when we talk about what open source really is, why it's being challenged. So we saw Elastic shift. We saw it shift to SSPL. A few weeks ago, mid-August, we saw HashiCorp change their fundamental premise. And I was speaking on a podcast with Erica Bresica, and that the phrase she kept using was the contract, the community contract. So you've taken from people, they've given you your contributions, you have a community contract. Now, Matt, despite running a successful business, you made a choice, and your choice was to donate to the CNCF.
Yep.
That must have been quite a difficult choice, right? Because you're talking about a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, again, you could decide to just close source it or change the license and make more money from it. I think we took the decision that we weren't going to do that. I mean, I can't say that it wasn't partly in our interest, because obviously the benefit of that means that the foundation runs it and more of the ecosystem is likely to start integrating with it. So from that standpoint, it was also like a benefit. So yeah, I just think you have to I guess that the problem is I don't think any founder sets out to think that they're going to end up having to mess with their licenses. And I think it's the commercial interests and the drive that comes from making a commercial success that often has the impact that we see. And I think a lot of founders who create an open source project on which they try to commercialize, they realize it's quite difficult. And although they might not set out to do what they do, I think it's quite easy to have plausible deniability when you've got some business people or commercial people that you can kind of outsource that decision to and let them take the decision, and you can benefit from that personally. I just think it's an area that's very tricky to navigate. And I'm not saying I have the answer to that. I just think that right now it feels to me like the commercial interests have taken almost more of a driving seat when it comes to what open source means to the community and how people start to engage with it and use it, because it's often being driven by commercial interests.
And if I was a betting woman, I know who I would bet you had the conversation in London with, but I'm not going to put you in that position. However, you may well know this phrase bait and switch, where some companies have been accused of purposely using open source because it's the way to build ubiquity, it's the way to build traction and usage of your software, and then switching away to a proprietary license later. And it's something that I can believe of certain companies, and maybe it's just because I'm a fangirl, but with HashiCorp, I don't believe that was the case. I mean, when you look at someone like Mitchell Hashimoto, there's a real open source dude who has really believed in this for a long, long time. And yet you see after IPO them shifting. Peter, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting you mentioned Michael right here. I think it's interesting what he has stepped down to the different role, right? And I don't have like an insight in this case what's going on, but I think, as you mentioned, that's kind of, well, one of the ways kind of to be kind of a step away from that the decision what your board, your CEO is making, which you may not, technically agree with, right? Like what I think about this, I think is this, right? I agree with Matt here. Is what, hey, not everything have to be open source. I think this is very wonderful what we have a competition of a different models, proprietary, SaaS delivered, we have source available, we have open source, that is wonderful, right? I think what is problematic is for people to try to redefine what the open source is, because there are many people associate like particular value with open source as a user, and for very good reasons, right? Because besides the license, what open source gives me is a permissionless innovation. I can take a product, right, hire a team and make it better for myself, right? I can also hire a variety of vendors. That is why those kind of non-competitive things, right? It's not just impact a few nasty commercial vendors, right? It impacts all of you because, well, if you know economics 101, when there is a monopoly, prices go up, quality goes down, right? We all know that. And I think what has happened right now also, and what I would expect, is that open source is getting increasingly polarized. Because I think one thing what we see with a Red Hat, with HashiCorp, right, with Elastic and MongoDB before that is what we cannot trust corporations, right? I think everybody reasonable will now say, hey, you know what, even if they are promising us the never open source, well, you know what, we will go open source when things will go hard in some year, right? And they'll say, well, guess what, we did not really use that opportunity for monetization yet, just, to the change of open source license. I think this is also not surprising what is happening now, because we have seen with economy not doing so good recently, many companies don't have that easy access to the capital, so we need to push on that, profitability as much as possible, and they're putting all the stops out, right? And open source license is just one of them, right? So I think we'll increasingly look at not just, hey, it is open source, but how is that open source governed, right? And remember, governance is different from the license, right? And governance is like what defines the project future, right? And is that governance done by some non-profit foundation which governs a project? in the interest of a community and ecosystem as a whole, or is that just a corporate entity which very naturally governs the project in the interest of its shareholders, right?
That's
I think there was not enough discussion of that over the last 2 years, right? And it felt like a commercial open source and foundation open source is kind of the same thing. Now we'll see, well, these are becoming increasingly different.
I mean, in the two kind of downturns I've seen, when things are good, most of the investors that I see feel like users come first. We can monetize them later. Whereas when times are tough, monetization becomes the #1 priority. So one of the things that I think I am starting to see more of is like looking at where the open source projects come from. And the CNCF is a relatively good start because you know you're somewhat protected by actually engaging with that foundation. Whereas if you're taking open source software purely from an Inc. or a limited company, you have to like go in with your eyes wide open that right now it might be under an Apache license and it's free to use. But at some point in the future, you're going to have to be on your guard in case that changes. And that's kind of what we've seen.
But I think there's an option. In some ways, sorry to interrupt you, there isn't really an option because those companies are driven by shareholder value, right?
That's what they exist to do. Yeah.
That's the purpose of their existence, Peter.
Yeah. What I was going to say, I think there's an interest in a third way, what we see in some cases, that's then the open source project is a foundation driven, but there is like one or several companies are building on that. Think about like a Cassandra, right, and DataStax, right? It's maybe not a perfect relationship, but a Cassandra is an Apache project, right? And you know what, that is open source, and then there is like that's extended version made by the company, and there are some other smaller companies which are also innovating in a Cassandra space, right? Or Apache Kafka and Confluent, right? And I think like if you are looking at even kind of commercial entity, that is good to see if that is happening. Well, Linux is obviously another example, right? We can see Red Hat, unlike HashiCorp, thankfully we cannot control Linux, right? Because, well, Linux is much bigger than Red Hat, and we can see what their action they have, obviously, counteraction.
It's the sort of single vendor dichotomy, right? Where you've got a single vendor product and you've got particularly if you've got a community that doesn't have a broad range of people or that the community's all been hired into the corporate. I think when you do your due diligence around open source projects and companies, those should be the things that are ringing alarm bells, right? So Liz, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think, the points about foundations I think are really important. When you said about Erica mentioning that kind of community contract or the kind of informal agreements that people, or the expectations that people have built up that companies won't change licenses. Well, we've seen it happen time and time again. We shouldn't be surprised. But one thing that you can do if you care about that license is use foundation projects. If a project is in a foundation, the foundation will ensure that the license will remain consistent forever. But I think there's a couple of interesting caveats to that point. And I am speaking as someone who firmly believes in foundations. And one of those caveats is who actually cares? And there's really interesting Twitter thread that Vlad, I can't remember his surname, but he's like, I am Vlad on Twitter. And he sort of went into the HashiCorp and Open Terraform model. And it's a very interesting thread. I won't try and sort of pressy all of it. But one of the points is there are a handful of companies who actually really care about Open Terraform. And those are the companies that are trying to compete with HashiCorp. So of course they don't agree with HashiCorp. Of course, that's why HashiCorp have changed their license. And I think there are lots of community people who are upset by the change of license, but for whom it doesn't actually make any real difference. It makes a difference to their belief system. It may be they're concerned about it from an idealistic point of view, but it won't actually affect them day to day. The people who actually have a horse in this race are the Spacelifts and the Palumis who are competing with HashiCorp. So, the kind of discussion of ethics and breaking commercial contract, I think, has to be seen through the lens of who Who is making these points?
Yeah.
Who is criticizing and why?
Yeah,
But I don't think that's the case, right? Because if you look at that, is exactly what those companies saying. Oh, that is not affect you, right? Oh, that's not going to affect you as a users, but that again goes to the same. What HashiCorp is about? They want to monetize their community harder. What that means for community? You are going to pay more for less. How the hell that doesn't affect you, right? Of course, of course it does. I think it's like as many things like governments like to do, right? Oh, of course that doesn't affect that. We give money here and there. Well, we're going to just raise your taxes on the back end, but that does not directly offend. It's kind of like a free.
Well, yeah, because
right?
when they open sourced, when they created that software and they open sourced it and they said this is what we're setting out to do, that's where the social contract comes in. And they have to accept that other companies will come and take that software and start to monetize it. Now they're realizing they don't want that anymore, so they're going to go. They're going back.
They are about the only company that I would take this from, because I know that when they set it up, they were very young and they didn't even envision this being something that was going into a company.
Agreed.
They scratched an itch, they created something to fix a problem, and events have overtaken. I'm not saying it's right.
But I don't actually have much of a problem with what I don't what HashiCorp have done is actually as bad as some of the other companies in the open source ecosystem. Actually, HashiCorp, they are trying to stop others, monetizing their software. Because actually, if I was starting an open source based company today, it might make me consider the BSL license that they've created, because actually, if I'm thinking about making a commercial success out of that business, I want to be honest up front and say, look, I don't want you to use this and monetize it. And in the past, we were doing that to try and defend against the cloud vendors, whereas it's interesting, it seems like HashiCorp are more interested in defending against smaller companies, which to me, they're not going to make it. I don't think those companies are making a huge difference to their bottom line. But it's interesting they made that decision to sort of make back. I don't know how much does Pulumi make a year ARR? I've got no idea. But it's maybe tens of millions rather than.
Well, there's a bunch of questions, right? So they're all making money. How much money is enough?
Well, that's kind of
Well, what I think is very interesting, right, with HashiCorp as example, right, what I like, Cillian, because what you said this kind of thing about like who cares, right? And I think what is important is as with every social causes, I think open source is similar. It is our job to care. If we want to make a difference, we should care, because if we don't, then we are going to be used and abused, right? That's just how it's going to go, right? Now, what I like about the HashiCorp change of this kind of OpenFT initiative is how quickly they gathered that momentum, right? You can see there is a lot of companies and individuals signed up on that effort, right, and fork started. This is kind of a very early days, right? But I am very much hoping what they succeed, right? Why? Because we want to show the companies, right, if you employ this kind of a bait and switch tactics, right, what that is actually going to hurt you. So think a lot, right, before you are going to be going to do that. Now, I think besides.
Okay, I'm going to just say, let's suppose, I have no idea what HashiCorp's state of business is, but let's suppose that this is an existential crisis for HashiCorp, and would you rather HashiCorp ceases to exist as a business, or that it makes a change like this? And I would suggest that a lot of HashiCorp customers would prefer them to carry on as a business under a different model. Because there is another side to this social contract, and that is that lots of people have, they're paying money for things that HashiCorp supply them, but it would be a problem for them if they just disappeared overnight. I feel like there are layers to the social contract that are not just about the open source. It's about
of course. But I think in this case, it's kind of, hey, you know what, you're getting in this case about like a situation, like in this case, like how many people there are, right, in a HashiCorp, right, and I would believe me, right, what the majority of that is going to be like a sales and marketing, actually those like an engineers which you care about, right? So I think that is a kind of a good, question to ask, but that is kind of like again, unrealistic, and that's how they want to get that kind of a situation.
But I think they've put themselves in that situation, but I think this is the case for a lot of successful open source companies that took money a couple of years ago, because again, naming no names, but I know lots of open source companies that took crazy money at insane valuations. All of the leadership of those companies took amazing secondaries so they can take cash out. They become rich. They don't care what happens to their employees. Well, I mean, I'm not saying that they do. They probably do. Of course they do. I mean, of course they do. But they can succeed.
Yeah,
and it doesn't matter if the valuation means that we have to take some difficult decisions down the line that kind of maybe go against our open source morals, or possibly mean that we have to do some reduction in headcount, because they're smart people. They know what they were doing, and they had the opportunity to take money off the table and do it at these ridiculous valuations. And now the market's changed, and they're trying to sort of like pare back from that.
Yeah, but they're sort of boxed in. They're in a position where...
Well,
well, no, they're not, because a lot of them have already made their money.
That's what I mean. They've made those decisions, and now they're sort of stuck with them.
Correct, yeah.
And I think that is very hard to kind of, after you got, from, let's say, 100 people, right, to 1,000, 5,000, right, it's very hard to get that things out of control, right? But I think here is at least another interesting point, right, what you're talking about, because you can talk about the HashiCorp customers, but you think about like an ecosystem and a universe at large. And I think, well, one of the wonderful things about this capitalism is, competition of ideas, and companies who make stupid decisions, they should fail, because then other companies would not be entitled to take those decisions, right? Or your customers will have more questions, right? Well, are you being prudent, right? Are you being prudent in your decisions, right? And you know what? If you are taking the steps what other companies failed before you, maybe I'm not going to buy your product.
And actually, this change to a BSL license maybe is off the back of some, crazy valuation they had that they're trying to work back from right now. So they're boxed into a corner. They've had to make this decision to try and maybe defend against competition, or just to kind of reduce the threat of the existing competition. But either way, they've had to make that decision, which now gives another fork an opportunity to compete against them. So they've almost being punished for decisions they've made in the past. Now we can let the market decide. And that's what Kelsey was saying that this morning. We don't know yet whether the market is actually going to compete.
Peter, I'm going to bring you back, because we've got 8 minutes, and I want to get to a final question. I did want the conversation to free flow, and I said to you at the beginning, the one thing you would take away from this is that there isn't enough time, because I know I could listen to this conversation for hours. We've not just seen this as a result of license changes. We've also seen things like ethical licensing, the war in Ukraine, political wear. We've seen AI, and we've seen terms like open washing and faux pen. And for me, you can't use any of that unless you're quite firm about what open source is, which is why I always go back to this sort of legal definition. And what Peter was talking about was permissionless. It's not quite because you've got a license, but the thing about open source is everybody, everywhere in the world knows that they can use it without restriction beyond the license, and they can trust and rely on that. But, I mean, we should probably pause and talk a little bit about the AI and the other factors, but we've now got 6 minutes, and I also want to talk about where we see the future going. So, will I work on the basis that AI, the political piece, we skip over and we get into the where we think it's going, or do you want to just take 30 seconds each to make some comments about that ethical licensing and the AI piece?
I will. The ethical licensing, I think, is so interesting. Do you remember there was, a couple of years ago, that huge furore about ICE in the US, GitHub allowing them to use, and people trying to say, I do not want my open source project to be used by that scenario. And that just isn't compatible with the idea that everyone can use things. So, but you can see very well-intentioned people really struggling with the sort of cognitive dissonance between, I want to believe in everyone being able to use my software, and yet I do not want to have invested time and energy in something that's being used for something I fundamentally disagree with. Very difficult ethical question, which we essentially just pass off through open source
It's
licensing.
too hard, right? So personally, I've avoided AI until this year when I've really been forced to deal with it because it comes down to these ethical questions and they're just too hard. I don't want to be responsible for them. I don't want to be making those decisions because everybody's ethics are different, right? And we should allow everybody to make those decisions. But I think with open source and AI, that's not going to be the case. And what we're going to end up with is what the OSI is doing, which is a new definition of open source AI. And I don't think that's necessarily about individual choice. I think that's where governments are going and codes of conduct, and that there's just no point in doing straightforward open source. But that's a conversation probably to have in a year's time. So with just over 4 minutes left, where are we going? We've got this imbalance where I guess the pace of adoption of open source is something none of us could have imagined. The way it's been adopted, the adoption is faster than the understanding, and we've got an economic imbalance. And I thought some of what Kelsey was saying this morning was really sad, and the way that he feels about it, it was really quite heart-wrenching. We've got this situation where companies are making a fortune out of individual maintainers' work. What's the future of open source? Where are we going? Matt?
I mean, open source isn't going away anytime soon, I don't think. I mean, just think about the number of companies that have been able to start because they've not had to go and pay for proprietary licenses to get started on day one. And it's now available in the cloud. So it's such a fundamental driver of innovation. And that there's so many more people are coming to open source now because of what it's done for, you know, for companies, as well as like visibility in the way it's used inside organizations. So I don't think it's gonna end. I just think the way we think about it and the models that we apply to it, I think we're gonna have to rethink them in some ways. And I honestly don't know what the answer to that is at the moment. But I think we're gonna have to think very carefully about who's behind the project, what their ultimate intentions are, and we're just gonna have to start getting a bit more real about what the potentials are before we start making decisions on the type of code that we use. Because I think in the past 6 years, there's not really been that sort of thought to the code that's been brought into organizations to be used. It's been all about features, speed, productivity, and we've thought less about, in some cases, the security, the governance, the impact on commercial and so on. And so I think there's going to be a lot more discussion and conversation about what's this code, where's it come from, how are we going to use it, and where could it potentially go into the future? Whether that means using foundations or other ways of looking at it, I think that's what we're going to end up having to do and think about.
That broad set of criteria is something that we're increasingly seeing described as curation, the sort of good technical hygiene and good governance of open source software. But that thinking about what you're going to do with the code and realizing that you, the end user, are responsible, I think is going to be something we hear more and more about. Peter, I know you and I have heated conversations about this. The opposite of open source is not closed source. The opposite of open source is proprietary. And that's what it is right now. Thoughts?
Yeah. Well, so I think in this case, what we expect to have more variety, right? I think what we have right now is kind of black and white, open source and proprietary, nothing in between, right, is not serving community well anymore. Because there are a lot of people say, hey, you know what, I want to, let's say, give you access to your source code, but I want to restrict some rights, being that ethics, privacy, non-competitive, right, or you name it, right? And we need more language on that, right? And I think it's like a problem, I think, what in open source space, we don't really have any organization which kind of focused on that, right? On the truly needs open source ecosystem has, right? OSI is kind of defending open source standard and not really caring about anything else, but that is not what community needs right now, right? I think we need something maybe closer to what you think is a Creative Commons, where it has a variety of licenses for different purposes, right? You want to have it something like, hey, use for any purpose without attribution, right? Or, well, this is non-commercial use only. Fantastic, we have a language, right? You can pick the license for your needs and understand what that means.
Just quickly to add to that, the fortunate thing is now we've been in the open source open source has been around long enough, and we've seen enough different models and experiences play out that we can actually start to understand now how to make those decisions in advance of starting on that journey. Whereas in the past, we didn't really have that luxury because we were all just, I want to get it out there, I want to get my open source code out there, I want to see it succeed. That's what I wanted.
Yeah.
Whereas like we've done that, and we've seen all the various different models play out, and now we actually, as an ecosystem, are a lot more understanding of how these models play out. So that's, I think that you're absolutely right that that's.
So with a bit of sophistication, a bit of experience, and a lot of understanding that, you know, today 96% of code, whether it's proprietary or open source, has open dependencies. Now we can think in a measured way about our ecosystem, about our definitions, about an ontology. We're right on time, but I'm going to let Liz add some thoughts to wrap up before we come to the floor for questions.
Finish with something positive.
Well, I'll be positive in the sense that I agree with what Peter's saying there. I think things like Creative Commons give us some really interesting models for flexibility. I would love us to not be so kind of dogmatic, so religious about what does open source mean, and actually have some more creative thinking about what licenses can we have that are, and I said I'm not interested in licenses, but I'm interested in the way that like the ecosystem can be successful within the, you know, bounds of capitalism, you know, and allow for open innovation and allow for the collaboration. I think foundations are going to play a big part in ensuring these social contracts. Yeah, and I think it would be great if we could not use sort of open source in capital letters as like a fixed thing that has been passed down on a tablet of stone. You know, we need to be a little bit more creative.
I agree, and I had the conversation with Bruce Perrins that he didn't go up to the mountain and come back with 10 commandments. However, it is, as we stand, very, very black and white as in terms of it's open source or it's proprietary. But there is a space, we think, to look at what these things in between are and to start to give them a name and remove some of the friction, hopefully, from the conversation on a go-forward basis. So I did say at the start that I expected you would be surprised by the way this conversation went. And it's been an interesting prep for the conversation too, because as I said, these individuals are people I know really well, and we regularly have these conversations. As a lawyer, I'm going to give you a health warning. Don't use Creative Commons licenses on software. They're not for software. You might want the ethos of what they do. Yeah. We need to get the right licenses in place if that's what we want. Do we have time just for a couple of quick questions, if there's any? We don't have to go anywhere. They'll stay as long as...
Right. So I don't have a hard stop in here. I'm going to pull rank, okay? It's my room. We can stay as long as we want. So very quickly, we're all adults. If you need to go or want to go, please feel free to go. I could stay here all day. Brilliant panel. Now look, I've already been approached by some people, so we'll do our best to get around. Again, panelists, if you've got to go somewhere, go.
No, all good.
I've got something at 4:30.
Yeah, I've got a dinner to get to at 7:30, but you know.
Right. Got this guy first.
And do feel free to leave. You're not captive. You're not prisoners here. And well done for sitting through what we've done so far.
Really quick question. So the community, from the perspective of contributors, maintainers, what has changed in terms of the landscape for them? And do you see any change in the motivation or incentive for maintainers to continue to maintain? So
the question is, what has changed?
So you've described some changes. I think it was Matt who said, yes, 20 years, the industry has changed. I'm just curious as to whether you see the landscape for maintainers, for people who originate projects, who contribute to them. Has anything changed in terms of their motivation, their experience that you see?
I have an answer to that. I think a lot more of them are being paid a salary by a corporation than they were years ago.
I think that's such an interesting point, though, because if you're a maintainer, the obligation to maintain flows with you as an individual, right? And it's just fascinating. So you contribute to something that you're paid to do by Company X, and Company X probably feels that it has ownership, but yet you
or doesn't. Maybe it's owned by a foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
You
So
know?
you, the maintainer, carry that with you, which is no doubt great for getting a job if somebody wants, you know, an expert in that area. But as Kelsey was saying this morning, it's a burden, right?
I think a big part of that, if as a maintainer, is to do with the expectations that you set up very early on. I think it's very tempting if you're, you know, particularly a solo developer, you've created something, people start using it, and you go, oh, amazing, people like my thing, and you've bend over backwards to help them use your thing, and then the next thing you know is you've been just overwhelmed with people expecting your never-ending support. I think actually being pretty clear pretty early on that, you know, your time is your own, and as a maintainer, you know, you are not expected to be, people's expectations can sometimes be outrageous. You know, what they expect people to do for free can be ridiculous. And I think as a maintainer, sometimes you just have to be quite firm and say no.
Right, and that doesn't just apply to code, that applies to the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
That sounds like Carla, who's
Yeah.
Nodding's life and my life and everybody else around the open source ecosystem's life, is you have to establish some boundaries. So the question was, what's changed in the 20 years? So the first thing is being paid. Matt, do you want to add anything?
I think that people are a little bit more wary, maybe, of the types of projects that they contribute to. And I think people now understand the impact of the maintenance burden of creating the project as well, which I don't think I saw as much 8, 9 years ago, because again, people were just excited about creating a thing that's going to get used. And the first time I found out that Cert Manager or KubeLego was used at Bose on their speakers, I was like, oh my God, I use a Bose speaker, that's amazing, you know, it's actually there. And that was an amazing
You
moment.
bought a speaker that plays your software. There's the irony of open source. Right?
Because I have seen the downside actually of being drawn into it. And if you're the type of person that can't say no or finds it quite difficult to say no, it does have an impact on burnout, and that's happened on my team a couple of times, whereas I've had other people who said, I'm willing to say no, and I know I can say no, and I don't want to be out there on my weekend solving this problem for this company who's using my software. And although I haven't heard it for a while, I still do sometimes hear a company coming to us and say, you should be paying us because we're finding your bugs and you need to help us to fix it. And so that does sometimes still happen. I think it's just more of like a knowledge awareness experience in the maintenance burden, which projects to work on. But fundamentally, there are still people get very excited about certain projects and just want to jump in with 2 feet just because it's the love. Or, as I found out from doing the Founders Forum, there's a lot of people still trying to scratch an itch and create an open source project that's going to solve a problem that they personally have. Before you know it, they put it online, they put it on GitHub, people are using it, and then maybe there's a business opportunity. So some things have stayed the same, other things I think have just come with a bit more knowledge and experience.
Peter.
Oh, well, I'll mention 2 things, right, maybe from a different angle, right? I think one of the interesting things in the last 20 years is what we have a lot of high anxiety, thin-skinned teenagers growing up who never can be
Okay, we might have to
offended.
cut this bit.
Right? in this case, right, if you look, it was kind of interesting for me to see, for example, all this, you know, debacle with, you know, like Linus Torvalds, like people are not, you know.
What you mean is we have healthy respect
you know,
for
able
our communities through code of conduct
to
and
take
respect.
his feedback, right, in this case. Well, and I think what is interesting with open source, because it's kind of so global, and there is still so many variants between the cultures, right? If your project is successful, you are going to go somebody from the culture, right, which is not going to be kind of some like, oh, well, I want to be very politically correct out here, you know, just make sure nobody is offended. You might get some Russian asshole.
And what was the second point?
Right,
Peter?
holding your project,
the
right?
second point you want to move on, what was
Right.
that?
You are Russian, right?
Yeah, I am. So that's why I can.
And moving swiftly on to your second point.
But I don't know. I feel like I saw more. But no, this is like 15, 20 years ago. I feel like I saw more flame wars, more anger and aggression. I think the structures that we've got through the places like the CNCF and the governance and, the codes of conduct, I think have made a big
Well, but
difference.
I think
you're
so
speaking
too.
about a different
there's a
thing,
bit
right?
that I've got the loudest mic. There's a bit that I love about this, and the bit that I love about this is how heated the conversations are today and were 20 years ago. And they're so heated because people feel that they have ownership. They've contributed somewhere along the way, and it does become like quite a dysfunctional family some of the time. But you do have those differences of opinion and debates, and they might have calmed down from flame wars to heated discussions, but we do still have them, right?
Yeah, I think we still do have them, but they're more often than not. I feel like I've often seen people say, I need to be respectful in the way that I approach this because there is a code of conduct, and everyone knows there's a playing field that we've almost created for ourselves, which I think has been very beneficial, and that's actually made open source projects more efficient in a lot of ways, I think. But again, we'll see where it goes from here.
But if you could, guys, you're talking about this kind of this interesting thing, right? Is let me ask how many open source projects there are, for example, just on GitHub, and how many of them do belong to some, formal foundations and have all that structure, right? I think what is interesting in this case, right, is what we do have really kind of different kinds of open source projects, right? And some of them is indeed saying, hey, this is kind of a big project, it's backed up by a foundation, or corporation, maintainers are paid a job, right? And there are millions, tens of millions of projects, right, which just relatively few developers, right? And their reality is completely different, right? And I think we often hear about those kind of unexpected things, right, when those things go out of a balance, right? Let's say somebody created this small library, it became popular, now there is a lot of users, so everybody comes to that hobby project and say, hey, you know what?
As you look at things like security in the White House trying to do a shopping list, that was the fundamental problem they had. You couldn't write a list of which open source needed to be checked out, tidied up, governance checked, curation done. Because the reality was you could go through a list of what you thought was most popular, what you thought was biggest, but then there's all these little bits that follow through that become dependencies and become critical dependencies, and it's just too big, right? And that's the fundamental governance problem, that you can't put all of those projects into foundations.
And talking about the future of open source, I mean, we're seeing the Cybersecurity Act, we're seeing the EU starting to talk about liability, and that could have a humongous impact on the way that we think about developing code. Because if you're developing code and you had to apply to the EU to get a certification to say that it's been built and written securely, how are you going to be able to develop an open source
I'm on the
project?
other side. I think it will have a huge impact on the EU rather than...
I think in this case, what I would be hopeful, right, what we'll get, let's say, some country passes some stupid laws, right, and then you can say, hey, you know what, guys, you cannot get any of that open source technologies. Deal with that, right? And then the government can learn, oh, you know what, we actually screwed ourselves by passing the stupid laws, right? Because I think too much what has been happening is, like a country's passed some laws, right, and all especially kind of big corporations trying to appease themselves, right, because they don't want to leave their business in that kind of big, but maybe not kind of very
so we're hitting an
human rights focused country, right?
We're hitting an hour of being on stage, and we're going to wrap up quite soon. No matter how much people want you to stay on stage, there's only so many encores you can do. I saw that there was one more question down there.
I think there's 2 or 3 more questions.
But what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit the lovely panel in how long that they can spend responding. Although I don't have a clock, I've got a phone.
So I think this is a quick one. I wanted to talk a bit more about what's changed and what that means for the future. So the GPL had a quid pro quo. That was enforced by the distribution model. But product vendors, i.e. the people in the business of providing values to end users, whether they're enormous people like Amazon or Google or just small people doing web apps, they don't distribute software anymore. So because free software is built on this distribution model, is there even some little iterative change we can make to the model that we haven't found yet? Or do we actually need a whole new idea of how technology is made available to innovators in this open way with all these ethoses we've been talking about?
That's a great question, but I don't think it's going to have a quick answer.
No, it's not going to have a quick answer. And just to make sure that that's a clear question for everybody, copyleft effectively means that if you take the code and use it, you have to give it back on the same license. And it's a very quick, simplest explanation. And when Richard Stallman created it, he did it as a way of protecting us from ourselves, I always like to think of it. So if you wanted to take the code away and do something different with it on a different license, you couldn't. And when you're choosing your open source license, you generally are choosing between that strict copyleft, something a little bit softer, and permissive licensing that lets you do most things, including changing the license. So I'm going to limit you, because I can see it on my phone, to a minute each.
GPL is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can always rely on Peter. GPL is dead, says Peter. Okay, Matt.
Does that give me 2 minutes now?
Maybe.
No, I mean, I don't know enough about that, but I would just say that sort of concept of giving back and sharing back the code, and I mean, that to me just seems, I don't know, you just reminded me, that's almost disappeared, whereas that was such a big part of the early part of my career, it seems, was thinking about the code that you contribute back, but where's that gone?
I think the opposite, in that it's almost more up the agenda than it's ever been, as we see other people make so much. And the question is, do we force them somehow to give back and not just take that open goodness?
But I mean, I guess if the GPL's dead, then what replaces
Well,
it?
I mean,
That's
look.
Peter's view. Come on. I mean, that's
Look. In my opinion, right? I think if you think about the GPL, as you're right, with SaaS, it doesn't quite work, right? Even kind of in the past, we'll have a lot of companies, would build their business on open, on GPL software, modify it, run for their own use, right? Or we also see some of the people saying, oh, we sort of like, give back things, but, like publish some patches on an obscure URL so we can be compliant with a spirit of a letter of a law, right, but not with a spirit of that, right? I think even in the past, right, the people found what's, I think GPL comes from as like a militaristic open source time. Richard Stallman saying, hey, if you found your friends using proprietary software, shoot them. That is the most ethical thing to do, right? But I don't think that is a reality like anymore. Right now, we can say that people are innovating. They may be embedding open source software in proprietary products, right? But that doesn't mean that's bad. They actually may be solving some important real-world problems. Right, like in this case, that is, I think, where open source is involved. Like you're giving back to the world, right? Doesn't have to be by contributing back to that open source software. It may be something else.
Liz.
I really hate GPL. I think I feel like the only people who benefit these days from GPL are like license troll people who come up with stupid lawsuits to try and get money. I just feel like it imposes conditions on the user of a software, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm probably saying all the wrong words, but it does impose conditions that mean that not everyone can use that software, or they certainly can't use it in the ways they would always like to. And GPL purists are like, but that's because they're doing it wrong, because they ought to be giving back to the... And it's like, maybe they don't want to give away 300 years of their proprietary invention, and maybe there is an imbalance here in what you're asking them to give away versus what they're taking. I just feel like that Apache licenses are much clearer in terms of what people's expectations should be. I would much rather find a different way of saying, how can you, do we want to have limitations on how we let people use it, or do we require people to give something back? GPL to me is open-ended in a really difficult way.
I think that word balance is what's important in the conversation.
Yeah, and Apache has been gaining ground, right? If you look at any research out there, Apache and our permissive license have been, gaining ground in the recent years, especially for the new products, right? I think like there are very few products which are newly launched which are choosing
Agreed.
their
I
copyleft
think when you
license.
look at that, you see that a lot of the code is on GPL, but it's if you look at by usage, actually Apache really is up there today. So I'm going to go to the final and third question.
Alex promised me a difficult question earlier.
I did.
Yeah.
So I'll be slightly controversial in that I think that open source can be a business model in that.
Can you just speak a little bit more?
I think open source can be seen as a business model, despite sometimes saying that.
You think open source can be seen as a business model?
In a world where, success is measured by adoption, and adoption often translates into money, then there have been many instances where people have released software as open source as part of a business strategy. And it's hard to say whether that's right or wrong. Like, there are definitely successes and failures for open source that was released for innovation or community purposes versus open source that's been released for more business-oriented purposes. But I think the biggest challenge, and this is the question, honestly, is we've moved away from a place where the people or the company or the organization or the community that owns the mind share was most likely to be successful, right? Because we were distributing software. Now, software is consumed as a service. And often, the people making the most money are the people running the service, and not the people that are actually have the mind share or own the IP or develop it or pay the developers.
And the question is?
So the question is, how do we change that? Like, how do we deal with that?
Okay.
Because in real life, we have, like, say, farmers make a tiny amount of money for the food they generate compared to the restaurant that sells the food.
Okay, so
What do you do
I
with
think
software?
fundamentally you're wrong in that open source is not a business model. Okay, we can't have any thoughts that open source is a business model. Even in what you're suggesting, the business model is the way that the money is extracted, right? So I would debate this with you for hours. I suspect that some of them will agree with me. I don't know if they all agree with me, but
I agree with you.
Good.
I do think you can say that a project is successful on some other axes, like adoption.
Yeah.
That can be a success
Absolutely.
metric, but that's not a business metric, and you
No.
don't get businesses making money.
if you get a job out in the back of it, you're getting a salary, that's the business model. If you get a service contract, I think there is potentially a new business model, and one that we should all want to happen more, which is government contribution of hard cash to the open source communities at significant scale, and that should be joined up globally, and that's a business model that doesn't quite exist yet, potentially. But I think the question is, how do we shift this? Because what we're seeing is that there's massive contribution and not very much being given back. So we're going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Bear that in mind as you're answering.
I just think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. That I think there maybe is that middle path. There is something that's between proprietary, pure open source on the other, and there is a middle path. But I don't at the moment know what that is. But I think it needs exploring. I've heard you say a lot of times open source is not a business model, but I am actually interested to turn the question back to you as to what makes you say that.
So fundamentally, the open source to me is many different things, but it doesn't, there's nothing about open source that brings you cash directly. The cash has to come through some
But if you take a very
process.
skeptical approach to it, you could create an open source project knowing you're going to own the trademarks and switch the license. So technically, you could use open
That
source
then stops
as
being
part.
open source because ultimately the
But my business model was
is
founded on open
No,
source.
but I think the point
bait
here
and
is what the
switch.
open
Which is
source
bait and switch, but
itself-
that is a business model, but
That's a business
not
model.
open source. That's abuse of open source to get to.
But it's a business model.
No, well, I think that open source empowers a number of business models, right? And I think if open source can be used with a number of different models, then open source cannot be a business model in itself.
It by itself, yeah, purely as it by
Right, so yeah, that is like maybe you can use open source, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
build
yeah.
different business models. That's why.
As a definition, open source cannot be used
so it's
as
the
a
bait
business
and
model.
switch bit that gets you the money as opposed to the open source bit in that
Yeah.
one,
You know,
I think.
well,
So I just don't think it can.
Open core, open SaaS, there is a lot of, just, pure services play. These are all the models which are around open source.
It's a strategy, not a model.
Yeah, but to go back to that wrapper, we don't distribute code anymore. The world has shifted. Liz?
We do sometimes distribute code. I mean, it depends who your customer is. I think there was something interesting in there in Alex's question there about mind share, which is, I think, sits somewhere between brand and community. So, if you have a trademark, you can have open source software, Apache license, but you still own the trademark. This is one of the things that happens when you contribute a project to a foundation. So Cilium, for example, is a trademark which was owned by Isovalent and is now owned by the Linux Foundation through the CNCF. So there's, let's say, mind share associated with that brand that people know about. And, I think your question speaks to, well, if you've invested a load of time and energy in building up a brand, how come other people then go and make money out of it? And I think that really speaks to open source is not a business model. You needed to have a plan fairly on in this process for what it was that you were going to sell, because it wasn't going to be that open source code. It might be some closed source code. It might be support. It might be training. It might be educational material. It could be T-shirts. Whatever it is, it's not that software. But you are right that there is a mind share thing there that it has some value. Brands have a value because you've got an audience that may be interested in buying something from
What about
you.
the brand name of an open source project?
Indeed.
You
That's
can
exactly
trade
it.
off the brand, purely off the brand. That's the value.
Yeah, this is the thing,
And that brand
Cilium is now a
piece-
foundation-owned brand that we're very limited as a company, as Isovalent. in
Again,
using.
knowing a lot about open source company insider gossip, I know that trademarks have been used as a business
and
strategy.
trademarks is absolutely. So the
of an open
problem
source
with
project,
open
a GPL
source, hang on
project.
just a second. So the problem with open source is Bruce Perrins was advised not to register as a trademark the words open source. So he didn't do it. And then about 10 years later, he tried to register it. And because it had become a descriptive term, couldn't. And I think that's the ultimate story to advise anybody working in it why you ought to register your trademarks, and the licenses all allow you to do that and to deal with trademarks separately. So trademarks are super important. Any more thoughts on the question we've got, just to wrap us up?
Yeah, well, I would say, I think what is also interesting with open source, right, is kind of how long it was around, right, and even kind of how long it was around as a mainstream, right, which I think from roughly, the 2000s, right? Many people have grown up, right, and their priority change, right? You may get into this case as this kind of, romantic student or something, and then you figure out, well, you know what, you have like, a couple of kids, aging parents, mortgage, right, and then your romantic priorities change, right, and the things you thought about, well, may not be, important anymore, right? And I think that is also like one of his challenges what we're speaking about. Like, oh, I didn't quite think early on about what my business model is actually going to be, and now I'm finding this kind of things, but I have something which is kind of value, but I'm not quite sure how I can monetize.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that is like one of his like attention and challenge what we are doing with, right? And I think like what my encouragement to all the open source founders would be like, well, ask those kind of questions, so like yourself, right? Think things through, right? If you, if you can, right? Because there is different choices.
Or find people who've been there and done it and can give you that advice, because that didn't really exist 8 years ago in the UK. So
Right,
it does now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like the people sitting on the sofa. Shameless plug, we're working with a university at Open UK to build a MOOC, a massive open online course, which Matt and I have been working a lot on. And then we're taking a lot of work that we've done before with people like Liz and Peter through our conference last year and through Future Founders videos that we did. They're actually quite good fun, but we did last year looking at things like product development, go-to-market strategy, that kind of stuff. And we also will carry on this and many other discussions around the whole open source picture at State of OpenCon, which will happen for a second time. We've raised the base funding, and we should be able to announce our post-FOSDEM February dates and our venue, I think probably in the next 2 weeks. So if anybody in the room is so inclined to get involved and help with content and things, let me or Open UK know. You can always contact us on admin@openuk.uk. So thank you for sitting through the longest panel in history. I'm sure that you still think it wasn't long enough, but please join with me in thanking our panelists this afternoon.